The text message came in at 11:47 on a Thursday night, which should have been my first sign that whatever followed was not going to be a normal conversation. My mother never texted. She called. Always, because texting was, in her words, what people did when they didn't have the nerve to actually say something. So when I saw her name light up my screen with a message instead of a ringtone, I sat up straighter on my couch without quite knowing why. The Hargroves are hosting a dinner Saturday for Elliot's promotion. You're invited, but please for once, just blend in. Don't make it about yourself. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the coffee table and sat there in the quiet of my apartment in East Ottawa, listening to the heat kick on through the vents and thinking about what it meant that my own mother's version of an invitation always came wrapped in a warning. My name is Vivienne, and I'm 34 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life being described by my family as the difficult one. Not difficult in any dramatic way. Just difficult in the way that things that don't fit neatly into an expected shape tend to get called difficult. I didn't marry young. I didn't stay close to home. I took a path that nobody in my family had a framework for understanding, and somewhere along the way I stopped trying to explain it, and just let them fill in the blanks with whatever made them most comfortable. What they filled it in with was, Vivienne is doing fine, we think. Something in healthcare, she travels a lot, she's very private. Please don't ask her too many questions because she tends to get defensive. I was not defensive. I was just tired of translating myself into a language that wasn't mine. My brother Elliot had been with the Hargrove family's engineering firm for 4 years, and his promotion to senior project director was, by all family accounts, the kind of milestone that warranted a celebration. The Hargroves were old money in the comfortable, quiet way that old money presents itself in Ontario. Not flashy, just solid. The kind of solid that shows up in well-maintained houses and good wool coats, and the assumption that their children would of course go to Western or Queens, and of course come back to run the family business. Elliot fit into that world in a way that had always impressed my mother and quietly relieved my father, who worried about things like stability and legacy, in a way that felt borrowed from a generation he wasn't quite old enough to belong to. I had met the Hargroves exactly once briefly at Elliot's Christmas party 2 years ago. I'd shaken hands with the patriarch, a man named Dr. Edmund Hargrove, a retired cardiac surgeon who had pivoted in his 60s to runnings in the family's construction and infrastructure firm. I remembered him as tall, quiet, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, and seemed to be cataloging information at a rate that most people couldn't keep up with. We'd exchanged maybe 4 sentences. Then my mother had steered me away to meet someone's cousin from Oakville, and I hadn't thought about him since. Saturday came overcast and cold the way October in Ottawa tends to, that particular gray that settles in around Thanksgiving and doesn't lift until April if you're lucky. I dressed carefully, not because I cared what the Hargroves thought, but because my mother's text had lodged itself somewhere between my shoulder blades, and I knew that if I showed up underdressed, she would spend the evening giving me the look, the one that said, I cannot believe I have to manage you even now, at your age. I wore a dark green blazer over a cream blouse and black trousers. Professional, contained, nothing that could be called a statement. My parents picked me up because my mother believed that arriving together signaled family cohesion, which was a thing she cared about in the same way she cared about ironed tablecloths. Not because anyone was really looking, but because the possibility that someone might be was enough. In the car, my father asked how work was going. I said fine. My mother adjusted her scarf in the visor mirror and said, without looking at me, that Elliot had worked very hard for this, and that tonight was about him. And I said, yes, I know. And she said she just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. And I said we were, and then nobody said anything else for the rest of the drive to Westboro. The dinner was at the Hargrove house, which was exactly the house you'd expect. A large stone Victorian on a quiet street with bare oak trees lining the boulevard and warm light coming through every window. Inside, it was the kind of warm that comes from actual fireplaces and not just good insulation. And there were maybe 30 people milling around in small clusters with glasses of wine and the particular social ease of people who have known each other for decades. Elliot met us at the door looking genuinely happy, the kind of happy that isn't performed for anyone's benefit, and I hugged him and told him I was proud of him and meant it. His girlfriend, who I'd met twice and liked both times, squeezed my hand and said she was glad I could make it. My mother immediately began scanning the room for people she should be talking to, which was her version of relaxing at a party. I found a spot near the bookcase in the front room and took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and let myself go quiet for a while. I was good at this, at being present in a room without requiring anything from it. I watched Elliot move through the crowd, easy and confident, and felt something uncomplicated happen in my chest, something that didn't have anything tangled up with our family's dynamics or our mother's expectations. Just my brother was happy. That was enough. Hargrove moved through the room the way retired surgeons tend to move through rooms. Unhurried, observant, with the faint authority of someone who's spent decades making high-stakes decisions under time pressure and has learned that stillness is its own form of confidence. I tracked him peripherally the way you track people who have that quality, not because I was trying to, just because people like that tend to pull a room's attention without asking for it. He was talking to a couple near the fireplace. Then to Elliot and his girlfriend. Then to my parents, who straightened almost imperceptibly when he approached, my mother's smile going up a register into its company setting. I watched her lean in and say something and gesture in my direction, and I looked away quickly because I didn't want to see whatever face she made while describing me to someone she was trying to impress. The dinner was called about 40 minutes in. Long tables set in the dining room, name cards, the kind of meal that takes real effort. Rack of lamb, roasted root vegetables, the kind of bread that comes from an actual bakery and not a grocery store freezer section. I was seated near the middle of one table, between a woman named Helena, who worked in urban planning, and a man whose name I didn't catch who turned out to be deeply passionate about the senator's defense strategy, which I found genuinely useful because it gave me something to talk about for 45 minutes without having to explain myself to anyone. The toasts started after the main course. Elliot's direct manager said something warm and specific about his work ethic. One of the other senior directors made a joke that landed well. Then Dr. Hargrove stood and the room settled the way it had, I suspected, settled for him for 40-odd years. Quickly, attentively, without being asked. He spoke about what it meant to bring someone into a position of real responsibility. He spoke about Elliot's steadiness under pressure, about a project last spring where everything had gone sideways, and Elliot had held the team together. He was specific in the way that people who actually pay attention tend to be specific, and I could feel the room responding to that specificity, leaning into it. And then, the same way it had happened in every version of this moment I hadn't been prepared for in my life, something shifted. His eyes moved along the table in the way eyes move when someone is doing a room scan out of habit, taking inventory, and then they stopped. Not at my mother, who was watching him with her company's smile fully deployed. Not at Elliot, who was already emotional in the best way. At me. He stopped talking mid-sentence. Not a pause for breath. A full stop, the kind that has weight behind it, the kind where the person doing it knows exactly what they're doing. The table shifted. Not dramatically, just that small collective adjustment that happens when something changes in a room and nobody knows what it is yet, but everyone can feel it. He picked up his glass again, set it back down, and then he did something I hadn't seen coming. He stepped around the corner of the table, not quickly, not theatrically, just with the deliberate ease of a man who has moved through high-pressure situations without letting urgency show on his face, and came to stand a few feet from where I was sitting. My mother's hand found the stem of her wine glass. I watched her fingers close around it without lifting it. "I'm sorry," Dr. Hargrove said, and his voice was the same voice it had been during the toast, measured, warm, built for rooms. "I don't mean to interrupt myself, but I need to ask." He tilted his head slightly, looking at me the way you look at something you're trying to place from a context you weren't expecting it in. "You look very familiar to me. Have we met somewhere?" The table waited. I set down my fork carefully. "Briefly," I said. "At Elliot's Christmas party a couple of years ago. Vivienne." He shook his head slowly, still looking at me, not dismissively. Like a man solving a problem he'd encountered before. "No," he said. "Not there, somewhere else." Something more recent. He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel 30 people watching him think, because he was the kind of person whose thinking commanded that kind of attention. Then something moved across his face. Recognition, the specific kind, the kind that isn't about social connection, but about something more concrete. "St. Michael's," he said. "Last February. The Delacroix case." The air went out of me very slowly. Not because I was afraid, just because I hadn't been prepared for this particular room to know that name. My mother's face in my peripheral vision had done something complicated. I couldn't look directly at it yet. "Yes," I said, quietly, evenly. Dr. Hargrove turned to address the table, and there was nothing unkind in his expression, nothing performative. He was just a man who had seen something and was going to say what he saw because that was how he was built. Last February, he said, my colleague's son was admitted to St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto in acute heart failure. He was 26 years old. His case had been misread twice, and by the time he came in, his window was extremely narrow. He paused. The fellow on call that night, who caught what the two previous teams had missed and who made the call that saved that young man's life, was the woman sitting right here. He looked at me. Dr. Vivian, if I'm not mistaken. Cardiology fellow at St. Michael's. The table went very quiet. Not the performative quiet of a dramatic moment in a film. The actual quiet of 30 people processing an adjustment to their understanding of who was in the room. My mother had stopped holding her wine glass. It sat in front of her, untouched. Elliot was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years. Not confused, something slower and more complicated than that. I didn't know, he said, and his voice came out rough at the edges, not angry. Just absorbing something. I hadn't planned on any of this. Not the room, not the moment, not the recalibration happening in real time across 30 faces. I had left that version of my life at the door of this house, the same way I always left it at the doors of family events. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because the version of me my family had agreed upon a long time ago didn't leave space for a different version to exist. And at some point I had simply stopped arguing with their version and just let it stand. My mother had known, in the vaguest terms, that I worked in medicine. She had never asked which hospital. She had never asked which specialty. She had asked once, at Easter, maybe 3 years ago, whether I was still doing that medical thing, and I had said yes, and she had said good, and then pivoted to asking Elliot about a renovation project, because that was a conversation she understood the shape of. Cardiology fellowships at Toronto teaching hospitals were not things she had a framework for. So she hadn't asked, and I hadn't offered, and the version of me that existed at family dinners stayed exactly what it had always been. The difficult one, the one who didn't quite fit, the one you warned before events. I looked at Dr. Hargrove and said, the Delacroix family sent flowers. That was more than enough. He almost smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that lives at the corner of the mouth, the kind that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where big things happen quietly. It wasn't enough, he said. Not for what you did that night. He turned back to the room, and his voice carried the same authority it had during the toast, except heavier now. I spend a fair amount of time in rooms full of accomplished people, he said, and one of the things I've learned is that genuine competence tends to be the quietest thing in any given room. The people who've actually done something rarely need to tell you about it. He glanced toward my mother, not unkindly, but without softening it either. Which means the people who underestimate them tend to do it loudly. My mother opened her mouth. Then she closed it. I had never seen her do that before. Run through the filing system of available responses and come up with nothing. Her whole social mechanism was built on always having a response, always knowing what to say to smooth a surface or redirect a moment. She was very good at it. I had watched her do it my entire life. Watching her not do it felt like something I didn't quite have words for yet. Helena from Urban Planning, sitting next to me, leaned over slightly and said, very quietly, well. I pressed my lips together to keep from laughing, which would have been the wrong energy for the room. Elliot found me afterward in the hallway near the coats, in that lull between the end of dinner, and the point when people start finding polite ways to leave. He didn't come in with a speech or an apology or any of the emotional furniture I would have needed to help him carry. He just stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at me in that particular way he'd had since we were kids, the way that meant he was thinking carefully about what he wanted to say. How long? He asked. The fellowship? 2 years now. Before that, residency in internal medicine. Before that, medical school in Toronto. I paused. Before that, you remember when I deferred my spot at Western to do a year of research? I did a second year after that, then went back. He was quiet, processing the timeline, rearranging things I imagined, the years that hadn't added up, the gaps in the story he'd been given. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. There didn't seem to be a version of our family where I could tell you without it becoming something else, I said. Something Mom needed to manage or recalibrate around. And I didn't want to hand her another thing to manage. I looked at him. I also wasn't sure you'd believe me. The story of me that everyone agreed on has been around for a long time. He flinched slightly at that, not defensively. He flinched the way people flinch when something is true in a way that reflects on them and they're honest enough to feel it. I'm sorry, he said. I should have asked more questions. You were told not to. Another flinch. Then, I'm proud of you. I want you to know that. Whatever I knew or didn't know, I'm saying it now and I mean it. I nodded. I believed him. That was something. My mother found me by the front door 20 minutes later, in the middle of getting my coat on. She had rebuilt herself since the dining room, the way she always rebuilt herself. Efficiently, without drama, because falling apart in public was not something she was willing to do. Her composure was back in place, but it was sitting differently than usual, slightly higher, like something altered under the surface. She started with logistics. The drive home, whether I'd gotten enough to eat, whether I needed her to ask Dr. Hargrove's assistant for the name of the caterer, which had been good, hadn't it? I waited. Then she said, I didn't know. I know you didn't. You could have told me. I pulled on my coat. Took my time with the buttons. I tried a few times in the early years, when I got into medical school. When I matched to internal medicine. You were always very busy, and I looked for the word adjacent to the main story. The one that mattered. She didn't say anything to that. I hadn't expected her to. I'm not angry, I told her, and it was true or true enough. But I want you to know that the warning you sent me, blend in, don't make it about yourself. That's been the instruction my whole life, and I followed it. I blended in so thoroughly that everyone in this family forgot to ask who I actually was. I adjusted my collar. That's not something that happened to me. That's something we all built together. Her mouth tightened slightly. She was not, and would never be, the kind of person who processed criticism easily or quickly. But something moved behind her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not quite remorse. Something earlier than remorse. Something that looked like the first step toward it, the moment of recognition that comes before a person has decided what to do with what they've recognized. We'll talk, she said. We will, I said. And I meant it. Not as a threat, not as a dismissal, just as a fact. We would talk, probably more than once, probably imperfectly, and it would be uncomfortable in the way that things are uncomfortable when they're true and overdue. But that was fine. I had sat with uncomfortable things for years. I could sit with this one too. My father appeared from around the corner with our coats already in hand. The way he appeared at moments of family tension, with the specific peacemaking energy of a man who had spent 40 years trying to keep the temperature down. He looked at both of us, read the room the way he always read the room, accurately, silently, without comment, and handed me my scarf. Ready? He said. Yeah, I said. I'm ready. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean in the way Ottawa air gets after dark in the fall. The kind of cold that doesn't feel cruel yet, just honest. The street was quiet. The oak trees along the boulevard had gone skeletal, branches reaching up into the amber wash of the streetlights, and somewhere down the block, someone had their fireplace going, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the cold. I walked to the car and I thought about the Delacroix case. A 26-year-old kid whose file had been passed over twice, whose window was down to a matter of hours by the time I walked into that trauma bay on a February night when the temperature outside was -22 and the hospital was understaffed, and the attending on backup was already juggling 3 other critical cases. I had stood at the foot of that bed and looked at his chart and seen the thing that had been missed twice, and felt the same thing I always felt in those moments. Not heroism, nothing so clean as that. Just the absolute clarifying certainty of knowing what needed to happen and being in a position to make it happen. He'd been discharged 10 days later. I knew because I'd checked. He was back home in Sudbury by Easter. Nobody at my family's holiday dinners had known that about me. Nobody had known about the other cases, the ones that went well and the ones that didn't, the residency years that had been brutal and clarifying in equal measure, the particular kind of competence that comes from being tested in high-stakes environments over and over, until it stops being something you perform and just becomes who you are. They'd known Vivienne, the difficult one. The one who didn't quite fit. The one who was doing something in healthcare, probably. I got in the car. My father put it in reverse. My mother sat in the passenger seat looking out the window at the Hargrove house, still lit up warm against the dark. She didn't say anything on the drive home, neither did I. But somewhere between Westboro and Centertown, in the quiet of the car moving through October streets, something shifted between us. Small, not complete, not resolved, but real. The beginning of something that might eventually become honest. Which is, I've learned, how most worthwhile things start. Not with a dramatic revelation, not with a speech that lands perfectly, but with a silence that means something different than it did before. I stared out at the Ottawa River as we crossed the bridge, dark and flat under the night sky, moving the way it always moved. steady, indifferent, unbothered by any of the small human reckonings happening along its banks. I had spent a long time letting other people's idea of me take up more space than the actual me. I don't think I'll do that anymore.